that's enough from me. Tonight we are talking about squares. Not just London, we're going to venture to Oxford, we're going to venture to Bath, we're going to venture through history as well, from 17th century all the way through to 18th century. Each of the five of us is going to talk about one of his or her favourite squares. We will then throw it open to a vote for you to vote on who has given the most convincing case, or if not a convincing case, who has shown the most beautiful photographs of a particular square. And then we talk about Parliament, one aspect of Parliament Square. When we were discussing what we were going to do, nearly everyone wanted to do Parliament Square because it's got so many stories in it. So we decided to divvy it up at the end, and we will each do a minute or two on one aspect of Parliament Square in central London, so that we give you a little bit extra, and then we'll do some questions. So hopefully we won't talk too much, or I already have. And I will hand over now to Emma, who is going to kick off this evening's Festival of Fun. So over to you, Emma.
Great. Thank you very much, Don. And hi, everyone, from wherever you are in the world. Already lots of people have said hi. It's just wonderful to see you all this evening or morning, wherever you are. And I am now going to, because I'm in charge tonight of the presentation, as well as doing the first couple of squares. I've just snuck in a second one, but hopefully I've got my stopwatch going and I'm not going to take up the whole hour. I'm going into the screen share and we'll start our story of squares. Can everybody see can I just have a thumbs up? Thank you, Leo. Great. I'm going to reduce so that I can see my screen. And our square story tonight begins with one of London's earliest squares. And this is what a square is. It basically describes a shape, but also a way of living in London. All over London, there are literally hundreds of what we call garden squares. And actually, it became such a popular idea of living around an open garden in the centre that it spread beyond London. And Don and Rachel tonight are going to take you on an excursion out of town to talk about some countryside squares. But this one is quite a good one to start with, actually. It's the earliest of our squares tonight, and it is called St. James's Square. I don't know if you can see the church in the background, but that church is the Church of St. James's on Piccadilly. So we're right in the centre of London. And this square was set out and started to be developed in the 1660s, just after King Charles II came back to take the throne at the end of the shenanigans after the Civil War and after the Protectorate. So in 1662, he gave one of his very closest advisors 45 acres of land right next to St. James's Palace on which to build new housing. And this was the centerpiece of that development. St. James's Square, so named after the palace, with the church beyond, a new residential district for London. And I've just sort of faded in a portrait of Charles II sitting there looking very splendid, typical royal portrait, in his robes of the Garter with his crown next to him on the table. And, you know, a very much the sort of style of fashion of his court, the Restoration Court, and later. And look who he gave the land to. This is a portrait of the Earl of St. Albans. Now, St. Albans and Charles were very close, as I've said. St. Albans, the older man, but look, they both had a pretty fine taste in fancy clothes, I reckon. And what St. Albans wanted was the most fashionable people of the land, the richest, the most powerful and influential, to come and live in his new district. And he succeeded, because within not very long, there were 7 dukes and earls living in his brand new St. James's Square. There's even a bit of scandal here, and you can look it up. after, after today, perhaps, there are some people who think that actually St. Albans and not Charles I was the father of Charles II. Could this be possible? I mean, looking at their portraits, if you can see their two faces, I don't know. But the square didn't stay as uniform as it had when it was very first built. Soon people started to pull down their houses because they were given freeholds. That was very important about St. James's Square, and to rebuild new ones in the newest taste and style. So if you look at this view, same view of the three sides of the square looking north, because the south side was never as interesting. Just note this house on the right-hand side. It's called Norfolk House. And here is a view of the square today from the centre of it. Actually not that different, but the style of the gardening has changed. So there have been at least 3 or 4 different incarnations of plantings of St. James's Square since it first began. And the idea of these squares is that the people who live in the buildings around them have a key. The residents have a key and they can get in, and everyone else cannot. St. James's Square is actually quite unusual in that it's owned privately by a trust. It's got its own Act of Parliament that set it up, but it is it's open during the day to the public. So that's quite nice. We can go in and have a look. And all sorts of people have lived here. Ada Lovelace, one of the great mathematicians, early computer scientist, lived here. She was the daughter of Lord Byron, by the way. Thomas Carlisle founded the London Library in the corner that you can see right in the middle of this screen shot. And it's still there today. It's a private lending library, and he founded it because he found he couldn't get books from the British Library. It's full of clubs. So gradually the aristocracy who owned the houses eventually moved out, and club houses for people who owned property in the country but needed somewhere to stay in London started to be formed here in this area of St. James's. And St. James's today is still stuffed with these clubs. So on the left-hand side of the picture, the East India Club. As we just go round very quickly, in the far corner on the right is a club for the military called the In and Out. It used to be the home of Nancy Astor. So you can see how the rich and powerful have lived in this square. Now, behind this rather splendid equestrian statue of William III is what Norfolk House used to look like. It's been demolished and rebuilt twice, but inside was this interior. And when it was knocked down, it was taken to the V&A, the Victoria and Albert Museum, and you can see it there today. And actually it was the birthplace of George III. King George III was born in a house on the site of this one, which belonged for years and years to the Duke of Norfolk, and it was the headquarters of General Eisenhower in World War II. Right, time moves on. I'm just showing you this one very quickly as a contrast. A residential square in London, still very much used for that today. All houses as family houses, and it's called Edward's Square, so late Georgian. And the top right-hand picture shows the temple where the gardener lives. If you have the job as gardener, you get a house. And I like the little inscription, partly built by a Frenchman. So one day, go and have a look at Edward Square, and look, you can sit inside on Garden Square open weekends. You can get access to this private garden, and it is absolutely beautiful. Right, I've done now. I'm handing over to Don, who's taking us out of town.
Yes.
Don.
So, yes, we're going to go to Radcliffe Square in Oxford. So I think Emma's got a slide for that. There you go. I mean, we could spend just the 5 minutes looking at this and gazing at how wonderful and beautiful it is. It is one of the classic views of Oxford. We're looking at it from the balcony of the University Church, St. Mary's Church, looking down on the sun shining on this wonderful Oxford stone on a thing called Radcliffe camera in a second. And I'll touch on that in a moment. I'm not sure I can point at things with, oh, maybe I can. Can anyone see a little arrow floating around? or not? No, probably not. The building in the background at the left with the green roof and the spire is Exeter College Chapel. Thank you very much, Emma. Over on the right, the rectangular tower is New College Bell Tower. This one just over there. Thank you. And we are looking at on the left, and the angles are curved because of the way that the photo's been done. But on the left, you have Brasenose College, one of the Oxford colleges. It's been there since 1509, derives its name. There was a Brasenose Hall there before, and it derives its name from a bronze knocker that used to be on the door, the Brazen Nose. About 400 undergraduates, 200 postgraduates, and alumni include David Cameron, the last but two Prime Minister, the Conservative Prime Minister, Malcolm Turnbull, a previous Prime Minister of Australia, the authors John Buchan of the 39 Steps fame and William Golding of Lord of the Flies fame, and Elias Ashmole, who was the one who founded the Ashmolean Museum in Oxford, a wonderful museum in the centre of Oxford that's well worth going to. On the other side, you have All Souls College, and that is a unique amongst the Oxford colleges in that it's a college entirely of fellows. There are no undergraduates. There are a handful of postgraduates, and I mean a handful. I mean fewer than 10. Everyone else there is elected to be a don, a fellow of the college. It was founded by Henry VI, 1438, for those of you who are collecting dates. And what we can see here is the quad that was designed by an architect called Nicholas Hawksmoor. He was a student or mentored by Sir Christopher Wren. He built half a dozen, oops, we've gone forward one. He built half a dozen wacky churches in London. He was helped out John Vanbrugh in the building of Blenheim Palace and the building of Castle Howard. He built All Souls, the quad here and the Codrington Library, which is the thing that with that arched window you can see just to the back of it, built that in a sort of Gothic style. He's also the one who plans how Radcliffe Square would look. In 1714, Dr. Radcliffe left money to the university to build a library in his name, and Hawksmoor was given the job of planning the square. So they knocked down a few medieval buildings. Hawksmoor liked the idea of having a circular library in the middle, because that would then complement the buildings on either side without distracting from them. But when the competition was done for who was going to be given the job to design it, he didn't win. It was won by someone called James Gibbs, who we will meet in Tim's talk probably in a second. And he is the one who built this library. It is made from Headington stone and Burford limestone, so that gives that lovely soft warm colour. Foundation stone laid in 1737 but finished in 1749, and this lovely sort of domed roof. It used to be open on the ground floor, so you could walk in and it was like a great big sort of market hall almost, but that was closed off in the late 19th century. It is now all part of the Bodleian Library, the Bodleian Library being the main university library in Oxford, and therefore not open to the public, unfortunately, which is a great shame. There's one more thing about All Souls that I forgot to mention, and I only discovered it today, and it is one of those wacky facts that is somehow not quite believable, but every 100 years they have the Mallard ceremony in All Souls. And the last one was 2001. So none of us are going to live again to see the next one. But what they do is they have a great feast. And after that, all the fellows carry flaming torches around the quad, singing the Mallard song, led by Lord Mallard, who is carrying a mallard on a pole. In the past, that has been a live mallard. The most recent one, 2001, it was a wooden mallard. And they are celebrating a myth that when the first All Souls was built, a mallard flew out from the foundations as it was being built. And I just love the idea of these incredibly clever people, because you have to take an exam to become a fellow of All Souls. So it is the brightest minds of Oxford University following a man who is Lord Mallard, dressed in costume, carrying flaming torches and singing a medieval song dedicated to the Mallard's bones that were found. Lovely. And I've looked for videos of it, but I can't find videos of it. I can't even find recordings of the song, but Google Mallard's song and you can find the words that they do. So as I said, we're viewing this from St. Mary's Church. So the next image is of St. Mary's Church, the University Church. That is where the university used to meet before there was a university. There was a church there of some sort, probably from Saxon times, built up in stone in the 12th century. What we can see, the tower and the spire are the oldest parts of it, and that dates from sort of 1270, so a mere sort of 750 years. The university used to meet there in the days when there weren't any other university buildings. They would have ceremonies there, lectures there, give degrees there, and they gave degrees in the church right through until the late 1600s when Wren built the Sheldanian Theatre. The bit on the left of the tower with the three windows is known as Congregation House, and that dates from 1320, and it's the oldest of the university buildings. It was where the university congregation met, the convocation rather, to decide the rules of the university and to debate policy. And above it was the very first library probably in the whole of England, that later moved to the new Bodleian Library when that was built in the 1480s. So this is an integral part of the wonderful University of Oxford. I have been promising the other four that at some point I will do a virtual tour of Oxford. I've been promising that since probably October. So I shall try and get that done for April, and you can find out more if I manage to get all of that sorted out. So that's Oxford. We shall now go back to London, and we shall have a look at similar to St. James's Square, a few more garden squares, and we'll do that with Leo. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Don. Would you be kind enough to spotlight me? Because in previous, I can never spotlight myself.
Let's try and click on that.
Just to
there we
remove
go.
myself. There we are. Replace me. Hi, everybody. I am taking you back to London, and I'm going to expand a little bit on what Emma talked about with garden squares. And this one that you're looking at is in Pimlico, which is near to Victoria, and it's a really lovely example of one of those highly desirable garden squares. And as far as London is so well known for its garden squares, and it's probably something that here in the UK, you think about any other city in the world, there are grand boulevards and there are big open spaces. But the UK, England is fairly unique. Well, you can't be fairly unique, you're either unique or you're not. But it's certainly one of the only places where you'll find squares, gardens that were designed for people to live around. And you find it all the way through. The first one, Emma showed you St. James's Square. Slightly earlier, we go back to 1631, And actually Covent Garden Piazza was the first, but we sort of joke about that. There were no only trees. It was paved. So does it really count as a garden square? We don't think it does. You really have to go into the middle of the 1600s to start finding this deliberate planned layout of homes surrounding a central grassy area. And the first one I'll be talking a little bit about later was in Bloomsbury Square and the Bedford Estate. But before I go to the Bedford Estate to talk to you about Russell Square, I want to very briefly mention the next slide. If Emma can show you an overview, one of the areas that ended up with the most garden squares is this area here. You're looking at an overview of Notting Hill. This is the Ladbroke Estate, and you will hear all sorts of estate names. Essentially in the 17th century, the Grosvenor Estate started to be laid out. St James's, Emma's already talked about. In the 18th century, the Portman Estate, the Cadogan Estate, the Bedford Estate. Here at Notting Hill, the Ladbroke Estate was laid out in the 1840s. And it is definitely, lots of you I'm sure will be familiar, will want to or have visited Notting Hill, the garden squares where they are still private. Key gardens. You have to be a resident to get into. Look at all that green space on your screens. You have to be a resident. You cannot get in without a key. And if Emma goes to the next slide, really came to prominence, came to fame when this gentleman climbed over the gate to take Julia Roberts into the garden. The next slide, Emma, that's of course the movie Notting Hill in 1999. Hugh Grant and Julia Roberts, they actually did use a square in Notting Hill. That was Rosmead Gardens. That's not the bench that they're sitting on at the end of the movie, but Rosmead Gardens in Notting Hill. But for my main square that I want to talk to you about, we are going to go to our next slide, which is an aerial view. Dearie me, put my teeth in tonight. An aerial view of Bloomsbury. And Bloomsbury, as I mentioned, the very first of the squares was Bloomsbury Square, and that was laid out in the 1660s. By the time we got into the middle of the 19th century, so the middle of the 1800s, pretty much everything that you're looking at in terms of the rest of the Bedford Estate had been built up. About 20 squares in total, making up the green spaces of the Bedford Estate. And the next slide, we're going to zoom in on the one that I want to talk to you about, which is Russell Square. Russell Square in the middle. And I've done a zoom in for you, courtesy of Google Maps. The reason I've chosen to talk about Russell Square, it's one of my personal favourites. You can see at the bottom there, you've got the blue glass roof of the British Museum, going round clockwise, that very imposing white and grey, the grey roofs and the white stone. That is Senate House. That is today the University of London's library. It's their administrative headquarters. But in World War II, it was the Ministry of Information, and it was the inspiration for Orwell's Ministry of Truth in his novel 1984. Moving all the way around to the other side of the square, there's a very elaborate, almost stripy building with some little green decor. Thank you, Emma. That one it started life as the Hotel Russell, because it's on Russell Square. Today, I think it's called the Principal. It's had a big change of ownership and a big refurb in the last 5 years or so. But the Hotel Russell, I will come back to in just a moment. Let's have a look at Russell Square. Emma, let's go and have a look inside. It is beautiful. It's the largest square in London, still to date. It was laid out in 1799 and it eclipsed Grosvenor Square as the largest. It is beautiful in summer, it is beautiful in the fall, in the autumn, lots of pathways. It was actually laid out by a very famous garden designer called Humphrey Repton. And when you visit Russell Square, it's open to the public. The joy of Bloomsbury and the Bedford Estate, not like Notting Hill, where you still have to be a resident and have a key. Almost all of those garden squares have been opened up and you can sit in them to have your lunch. You can walk through them. They are open from dawn till dusk, 7 days a week. And Russell Square is definitely one of the nicest. Some of the famous residents during the 18th into the 19th century and into the 20th century of Russell Square have included the architect G.E. Street, suffragette Emmeline Pankhurst lived in Russell Square, the founder of the D'Oyly Carte Opera Company, Richard D'Oyly Carte, also lived in Russell Square. And if Emma takes us to the next one, there have been lots of businesses as well as famous individuals. This today belongs to the part of the University of London. It's the School of Oriental and African Studies. It's one of their buildings. But in 1929, this was opened as the headquarters of the publishing house Faber and Faber. And Faber still exists today. They have a huge roster of authors and poets on their books. And one of their original directors, one of the original bods who was involved in deciding who was going to be published by Faber and Faber, was a very, very famous writer by the name of T.S. Eliot, who I have no doubt lots of you will have heard of. Very appropriate that his headquarters for Faber should be on Russell Square, because if you're familiar with Old Possum's Book of Practical Cats, which T.S. Eliot wrote, adapted by Andrew Lloyd Webber for the musical Cats, when cats go to the Heaviside Layer, what do they pass? They go up, up, up past the Russell Hotel, which of course Eliot would have visited on the other side of the square. He would have seen that every single day. Lots of amusing stories about Faber and Faber, mostly involving Eliot's wife. He was estranged from his first wife, very sadly. She was very mentally unwell. And some of the stories involve her walking up and down the pavement outside Faber and Faber wearing a sandwich board upon which she had painted, "This is the wife that T.S. Eliot has abandoned." She also famously poured a tureen of hot chocolate through the letterbox to express her disappointment, her feelings of abandonment. So that must have been a very interesting time to have been working there when T.S. Eliot was there. Faber still exists, but they're not in this building. They're now over on the other side of Bloomsbury on Bedford Place. One other lovely, interesting thing that I can show you before I move on and hand over to Rachel. This unusual little structure that sits in the corner opposite the old Faber and Faber building, this is a cabmen's shelter. And there aren't very many of these left in London. They started building them in 1875, essentially because our Hackney carriage drivers, they weren't really meant to go and take refuge in the pub. If you were sitting in the pub to warm up of an evening, then you were probably having a drink. And it wasn't very safe for our taxi drivers to be having a drink and then picking up passengers. So the Cabmen's Shelter Fund was started in 1875 to supply small lodgings, small buildings. They couldn't be larger than a horse and cart. That was part of the regulations. So these tiny little painted green huts that comprised a little kitchen, providing no alcohol, hot drinks and food, and there are 13 of them. They're all now grade 2 listed, and of the couple of hundred that were around at the turn of the 20th century, there are now just 13 left. And one of them, this one actually is open to the public. You can actually get a cup of tea from this one when it's open in Russell Square. So my favourite square probably in London to go and visit, so much to talk about. From garden squares in London, I am now going to hand over to Rachel, who is going to take us to Bath.
Thank you very much. Lovely. Even I learned something on that little bit. Yes, we are travelling, what's it, about 150 miles out to Bath. It's not that far, is it? I'm rubbish at estimating distance. And I'm going to begin, as you can hopefully see, I'm going to begin by talking about a person rather than the square itself, because this is the architect behind the square that I'm going to talk about. And this is John Wood the Elder. And if any of you have been on my Welcome to Bath tour, I talk fairly extensively about John Wood because he's responsible for streets such as the Royal Crescent and the Circus. So some of the most beautiful and striking streets of Bath. But he also designed the square that I want to talk about, which is Queen Square. And just before we see an image of Queen Square, just to recap on my favourite story about John Wood. He was a very serious architect. He took his work extremely seriously, and possibly because of this, maybe he was, you know, a little bit on the spectrum. He didn't always entertain the social niceties that you and I might employ. And he'd been asked to design 3 streets which sit just off Queen's Square. And he was desperate to have them registered. In order to do that, he needed to know what they would be called. So he decided he would go and ask the town councillors at their next meeting. But rather than wait for an opportune moment to ask this question, he burst into the meeting. And you can just imagine the scene. There were probably 20, 25 men all hunched over the papers for the meeting, all deciding what would be happening to Bath as a whole. And John Wood bursts through the door and says, "I demand to know, what will my streets be called?" And the town councillors have dealt with John Wood on numerous occasions. So one of them wearily turns and says, "Quiet, John Wood." And John Wood doesn't say another word. He turns and he leaves the meeting, quite happy that he has an answer to his question. Because a couple of weeks later, 3 streets are registered: Quiet Street, John Street, and Wood Street. And although it's very difficult to verify the origins of this story, if you visit Bath today and if you visit the square in question and you just do a little detour off, you can see Quiet Street, John Street, and Wood Street. So I love to think that there is some truth in it. But we are here to talk about his creation, which is Queen's Square. So if Emma just clicks on the next bit of the image, you will be able to see the square as it was in 1804. It was actually laid out between 1728 and 1736. And what you'll see as the focal point in the square is the obelisk. A little bit unusual to have an obelisk in the middle of the square. It has an inscription that was written by Alexander Pope. But the inscription is literally just an inscription to the Prince of Wales, who the obelisk was dedicated to, and Richard Nash, who unveiled the obelisk. So I can't find any information about why they decided to have an obelisk, what the reasons were for it. But what you will notice is that in 1804, it had almost a needle sharp point on the top of it. Now, if we move on an image, I hope the obelisk is in the next image, but what you'll notice from the next image is that in the 1830s, yes, it was the same angle that I chose. So in the 1830s, it was struck by lightning and was completely blunted, which is why it's much more rounded at the top today. The square, as we've been hearing with so many of the examples this evening, it's a really lovely place to go and visit. Normally, sadly, it's something that I walk through on my way up to the Royal Crescent, but it does merit a little bit of time if you can spare it. And it's called Queen's Square. Again, we've been hearing all through the course of the evening how desirable squares were, particularly as residential locations. And so people tended to name their squares quite carefully. And in this instance, Queen's Square was named after the wife of George II, who was on the throne when the square was laid out, and that was Caroline of Ansbach. But cleverly, by calling it Queen's Square, the architect or the registrar knew that it would have longevity. And this is not the only square to be named after royalty. So I'm going to talk now about a famous London square that was also named after royalty. So if we click on to the next image, this is Albert Square. And Albert Square takes its name from Prince Albert, the husband of Queen Victoria. In fact, Victoria and Albert probably gave their names to more things in London than any other royal couple before or since. And Albert Square is in Stockwell in South London. again, a hugely desirable part of South London to live in. You can just about see some of the large houses that surround the square there. It was built over market garden land. So again, we've been hearing a lot about garden squares, and you can see it retained some of the garden in the middle of it. But any of the Brits who are on the talk this evening or viewing us on Facebook this evening, when they think of Albert Square, they almost certainly think of our next image, because Albert Square is the name of one of the most famous fictional squares in the United Kingdom. So here we don't just have real life squares, we use them as the location for one of our longest running soaps, which is Eastenders, which actually started, I looked it up, it started in February 1985. So we've just had the 36th anniversary of the soap's existence. And Albert Square in the made-up borough of Walford is where most of the drama, most of the action takes place. And not really a garden square perhaps, but at least they do have a little bit of greenery in the middle there. Now in Eastenders land, a house on Albert Square would probably be affordable for most Londoners. In real life, a house on Albert Square is currently on the market for £3.25 million. So when we're talking about squares as being desirable locations, we're not messing around, we're not kidding. 3.25 million. I mean, I'm sure I've got that down the back of the sofa somewhere, but yeah, it's quite extraordinary what people will pay for living in one of these enclaves. Now, as I say, Albert Square, probably one of the most famous squares in the United Kingdom. And I'm going to hand over to Tim, who's going to talk about another famous square.
Thanks, Rachel. Absolutely fantastic. It's marvellous. Well, seeing Albert Square there takes me back to my days when I appeared in Eastenders. We did some filming in there. But I'm going to talk about Trafalgar Square, my favourite square. Now, every schoolboy knows that in the middle of Trafalgar Square there is this amazing structure, Nelson's Column, and the fact that it is the same height as the mast of HMS Victory, which was Nelson's flagship at the Battle of Trafalgar. Except it isn't. This is a complete myth, because this obelisk is 169.3 feet tall, and Nelson's flagship was 205 feet. So this is the first of these facts that I'm going to give you another 9 completely useless pieces of information about Trafalgar Square that you didn't previously know. Now, look at the bottom and you will see we have these lions here, 4 lions. These are fakes. The original lions are 250 miles north of London in Bradford, outside the Mill School. The originals were carved in stone, and the designer, Thomas Milne, reported to Queen Victoria that he was somewhat disappointed that these lions by Edward Landseer were put in 1867. Let's go to the next picture, because you probably are not aware that underneath Trafalgar Square is a tunnel. And that's me there walking underneath Trafalgar Square. In 1970, when the Jubilee Line extension ran to Charing Cross, they needed somehow to get the spoil, get the earth out of Charing Cross. The way they did it was dig a completely different tunnel underneath Trafalgar Square, which came up in what is now the National Gallery, but then was a building site. And so they took the rubbish out that way. It's a straight line, except it kinks around where Nelson's Column is. The whole of Trafalgar Square was originally going to be knocked down by Charles I, because it was a place where he had his stables and his bird cages and his barracks and all those kind of things that royal people have. And he wanted to have an extension to his palace of Whitehall. But it never happened, which is just as well, because it would have been on the site of the National Gallery and Charing Cross Station and the equestrian statue of himself, which is where we're going next. And here we have, there he is, Charles I, bless him. Now, this statue was cast in 1633, and he had his head chopped off in 1649. The actual statue was hidden in the basement of the crypt of St. Paul's, not St. Paul's Cathedral, but St. Paul's in Covent Garden, and it took the Cromwellians 6 years to find it. When they found it, they said, right, this is going to be melted down for scrap, and they trusted a chap called John Rivet to melt it down. John didn't do that. He said that he would smash it up and sell the pieces to royalists. He didn't do that either. In fact, he kept the whole statue in one perfect piece and then gave it to Charles II, who put it on the site where it is at this moment. Incidentally, Charles I is looking at the banqueting hall where he was killed, and the horse is looking at the pub next door. In Trafalgar Square, there are 20 plus statues. Now, the smallest of those statues is George Washington. It was a gift from the lovely people of Virginia. It was only 140 years late, but that's no problem. And it was to relate the lovely love between our two great countries. Now, all of these statues that we've talked about in Trafalgar Square are Grade 1 listed and protected, except the one of George Washington, which is Grade 2, which means that it could be moved at any time. So watch out, George. Let's move on to the next slide. Every morning at 7 o'clock, there is an act of bioterrorism in Trafalgar Square. There are two Harris Hawks, here's one of them, Liam and Jack, and they are let loose from a white van at 7 o'clock to terrorize the pigeons, to get rid of them. It works. We've got the pigeon population down to approximately 1,000 pigeons. And while we're on the subject of security, let's go on to the next slide, because Trafalgar Square has the smallest police station in the world. And there it is. Now, I'm not talking about Doctor Who's TARDIS, because Doctor Who's TARDIS is mobile and therefore not a police station. This is made of stone. And as you can see, you can get one policeman inside it. It's now not used. They now use it to keep brooms and hoses and things like that to get rid of the aforementioned pigeon poo. Let's go on. No, we'll stay there for a minute because we've got the 4 plinths in Trafalgar Square. The plinths are these enormous, great stone blocks. On top of 2 of them, we've got 2 famous soldiers who I can't remember who their name is. On the 3rd one, we've got a statue of George IV, and the 4th plinth should have had a statue of my favourite king, William IV, but they ran out of money. So it was suggested we had a rolling exhibition of art. And in 1998, Anthony Gormley, the artist, said there would be a public lottery and 2,400 people would be allowed up onto the 4th plinth to do anything they wanted to do. And my friend Tim Jones was lucky enough to get on to the plinth. Next slide, if we may. And there he is, bless him. So he's dressed as an angel, wearing a pair of mechanical wings, which fluttered up and down. Very nice indeed. He's playing an electric cello, and he played a small selection of works by Bach. Now, the question, of course, is, first of all, why did Tim do that? And the other question is, why is Tim Jones still my friend? I can't answer either of those questions, I'm afraid. But I'm going to hand you back to Don, who I think is now going to either give us the results or hold the straw poll.
Yeah, let's do that. Let's have a little poll. We've each of us made a claim for our favourite squares. So we'll now chuck it over to you to all to vote for which one you think looks the most desirable, or the case that was the most convincing. Obviously, no prizes involved anywhere at all in this, other than complete bragging rights for the 5 of us, for the winner, who will probably put it on their CV afterwards. So I am going to try and launch the poll. And after we've done this, we will go to Westminster, go to Parliament Square, and have a chat about the stuff around Westminster. So let's have sort of 30 seconds or a minute. Be prepared to vote. Vote now as we launch the poll.
Ooh.
And it should be appearing on your screen. So vote for your favourite, and let's see where we go. Oh, I can see the results coming through here. Not how I thought it was going to play out. Oh dear me, Russell Square leading quite dramatically here. Yeah. And
Oh,
so
you guys.
there we go. I think we are probably there. If 88% voted, so the result is in no doubt already. I wonder if she can get a complete 50% on it. Any of you are going to do any last minute, any of the last sort of half dozen of you who need to vote? No. So I'm going to end the poll with Russell Square not quite getting an overall majority, but 49% of you favour Russell Square. A distant and a joint second for Radcliffe Square and Trafalgar Square, St James's Square limping in at 4th, and poor old Queen Square in Bath, almost nowhere.
Do you know, I think people were so blown away by Albert Square, they forgot about Queen's.
If we put Albert Square in there and
I'd have run away with it.
I'm sure that would have won as well. So let's hear it for Russell Square.
Oh, the minute you're all allowed back, I will take you all and we'll go in person and I promise.
We're drinking every hotel around Russell Square. Yeah,
I think you put them off your square, Don, with the flaming duck.
Yes, no, I'm completely. I think we should have our own Mallard festival done. I shall try and find the music to the Mallard song for us all to sing at some point. Right, we're going to have, oops, let's see if I can get rid of the poll. Show results, blah, blah, blah. There are the results. Russell Square wins. Let's
rub our noses in it, Don.
Turn that off.
Right, okay, can we get rid?
What was that? Sorry?
It's not good for egos, Don. Take it down, take it down.
I'm gutted. I'm not going to say anything else now, so only limping in a distant second, so I'm not going to take any more part of this evening's affair. So we're going to talk about Parliament Square. As I said at the beginning, Parliament Square is so full of things, and each of us could probably have done an hour on just the square, and it's something we do when we guide. We not quite take an hour at it, but we go into the middle of the square and you work around the whole square, the buildings, the people, the characters, the events that have taken place in there. So we've each picked one thing that we particularly like. We're going to talk about that for a couple of minutes, and we'll work our way around. Let me try and get it right, clockwise around it. So the first person kicking off is going to be Leo, and she's going to talk about the statue of Winston Churchill and Winston Churchill. So over to Leo for that.
Absolutely. Thank you, Don. Yes, the thing, certainly, as Don said at the beginning, so many things to talk about in Parliament Square. We've each picked one of the things that we each like talking about the most when we're there. And certainly because the vast majority of my visitors that I look after are from the US, there is certainly a real affinity for lots of people to want to see Churchill. So Emma's got the statue, and I'm sure lots of you will be familiar with this view of this great man, our very famous Second World War Prime Minister. The statue is a bronze sculpture. It's created by a gentleman called Ivor Roberts-Jones, and it was unveiled in 1973. Churchill died in 1965, so it took them a little while to get the statue in place, but it was unveiled by his widow, by Clemmy, by Clementine, Baroness Spencer Churchill. The ceremony was attended by the then serving Prime Minister, 4 former Prime Ministers, and Queen Elizabeth II herself. The irony of the positioning of this statue, though, any of you who have done my St. Paul's Cathedral tour will know already that I talk a little bit about Churchill because his funeral was there. The last of the great, you know, ever wanting to have control of everything. He planned his own funeral. He called it Operation Hope Not, which never ceases to amuse me. Operation Hope Not. And he actually, when they were laying out Parliament Square, they were replanning it and they were looking at this in the 1950s. And Churchill apparently pointed to a spot and said, "That's where my statue will go." And 20 odd years later, in 1973, even in death, he was getting his way and having control. And so there he is facing Parliament at the exact spot that he pinpointed as his 20 years previously. So the Churchill statue, I love talking about. So many other things about this great man that we could say, but in our limited time tonight, that's definitely the one that I love, the fact that even in death, he still has control of Parliament Square. Who's next? I forget who.
Me. I think we're moving round. So yes, I'll just throw in here as well that I'm doing my talk on Churchill on UK Tours online on Thursday.
Of course.
Yeah, London time. Tickets still available. I am going to talk about the building in front of us, but not Parliament. The Gothic splendour of Parliament, which is actually relatively modern, 1850s. I'm going to talk about the building with the low triangular roof in the foreground there, and that's Westminster Hall, and that's the oldest building in the whole of the square, the oldest surviving bit of Parliament. It dates from about 1100. William Rufus, William II, the son of William the Conqueror, had it set out. He even, there we go, thank you very much. He even wanted something bigger, and it was a sort of moot hall, a meeting place, a place where the king would hold court and receive petitions, and feasting would take place, and so on and so forth. It's changed a lot over the years. It has been used for trials. So great state trials. William Wallace was tried here and condemned to death. Thomas More was tried here and condemned to death. Guy Fawkes was tried here and condemned to death. You can see a pattern emerging. And Charles I, who Tim mentioned, the statue earlier on, was tried here after the English Civil War, tried for treason and condemned to death and taken out later and executed in front of Banqueting House in Whitehall. It's also a place where people, great leaders and monarchs lay in state. So Winston Churchill lay in state there before his funeral. The Queen's mother in 2002 lay in state, the Queen's father in 1952. All sorts of past rulers and famous people have laid in state there for the public to file past their coffins. These days it's used for meetings of both houses. So if there is a talk from someone, most recent ones include President Obama, President Xi of China, and the Pope, talking to both houses of Parliament in the great space, and it is a huge space within Parliament itself. And it also used to be used for coronation banquets. So after a coronation in Westminster Abbey, there would be a huge banquet laid out in Westminster Hall. The last one of these was 1821 for George IV, the most extravagant of all of our monarchs. It was so extravagant they could never do another coronation banquet after it. Subsequent monarchs felt they needed to look at least a little bit more economical. But one of the things that used to happen in the coronation banquet is that the king's champion, or the queen's champion, would ride into the hall on a horse in full armor and throw down the gauntlet to anyone who would seek to question the right of the monarch. And that was in a hereditary role as well. So the Queen's Champion was held by this family called Marmion and later Dimmock. It became the Dimmock family. The last one to ride into Westminster Hall was in 1821. But even at the Queen's coronation in 1953, a descendant, Captain John Dimmock, carried the Union flag as the Queen's Champion during the coronation. And that has passed to his son. The current one is Francis Dimmock. And if there is a coronation that comes up, he will be the King's Champion. And I don't want to put any sort of treasonous thoughts in your mind, but the current one, he is 65 years old and a chartered accountant. So if you want to challenge the right of Charles to be Charles III, this might be your best opportunity. So just keep that in mind for any subsequent coronation that we have. So we shall move round. We've done Westminster Hall, and I'll kick the ball across to Rachel to talk about the next building in our circuit.
Wonderful. I'm just waiting for the moment that UK Tours Online gets invited to speak to both houses in Westminster Hall. We're still waiting. So if anyone, you know, if our invitations got lost somewhere, then yeah, we'll be delighted to do it. Yes, I am talking about the far less well-known church in Parliament Square. I feel a bit sorry for St Margaret's Church because it's overlooked for many good reasons. I mean, Westminster Abbey is one of my absolute favourite buildings in London, and this sits right outside it. But yes, poor little St Margaret's gets sadly overlooked. The reason there is another church on Parliament Square is because the Abbey was originally a priory church. It was where the Benedictine monks would take their holy orders. And having parishioners traipse in and out for Mass was causing the monks consternation. They couldn't worship in the way they wanted to with all these people coming and going. And so another church was built, and over these centuries it's become known as the parish church of the Houses of Parliament. It wasn't strictly built as that, but that's how it has become known, particularly as the resident population has dwindled over the centuries. And many famous marriages have taken place in St Margaret's Church. We heard about the statue of Winston Churchill, and that it was unveiled by his wife Clementine. Well, Winston and Clementine got married at St Margaret's Church. But I also found out that the diarist Samuel Pepys, who you may know about because he chronicled the Great Fire of London, he got married in St Margaret's Church. But the interesting thing is, if you Google marriage of Samuel Pepys, which I urge you to do, you will find you possibly get to a page titled The Sex Life of Samuel Pepys, because apparently he not only got married in St Margaret's Church, he also conducted extramarital affairs in St Margaret Church, which he documented in some of his diaries. So a fascinating man for a fascinating building. And that's how I'm going to leave it. I will pass over to Emma, who I think has a connection with St Margaret's as well.
Right, yes. Well, thank you very much, Rachel. And I'm still licking my wounds from the unpopularity of St James's Square from our last load of talks. And congratulations grudgingly to Leo for being such an outright winner, and deservedly, I have to say. If any of you watching who've been so mean to me want to make it up to me, you could do it by coming on my Cotswold tour next week on the 10th of March, which I'm doing on my birthday. And I'd love to see you there, and we'll have a bit of fun on that night. Now, yes, Rachel's right. I do have a connection with St Margaret's because it's also currently the parish church of the Palace of Westminster. So all members of Parliament from House of Commons or the House of Lords, or people who work in the Palace of Westminster, have the right to be married in St Margaret's Church because their own chapel is very, very small. And so that's why Winston Churchill was able to be married there. You have to have a special license to do so because it's part of the Westminster Abbey Royal Peculiar. And I know all this because a very long time ago in 1991, I got married there on a very chilly January day. And so, yes, I do have close connections. But the things that I want to talk to you about in Trafalgar Square, we're going back to statues, are these three people that I have on the screen now. So going from left to right, I'm sure that most of you will recognize them, but three very worthy and new additions to the group of statues on Parliament Square that include prime ministers, and mainly prime ministers actually, but they also include, standing behind this person in the middle photograph at the back, Abraham Lincoln, and they include Jan Smuts, who was the only man to sign the peace treaties after both world wars. But we have a second South African I just want to introduce first, and here he is about to give us a hug from his 9-foot bronze statue, Nelson Mandela. And I think it's a wonderful, joyful thing. A fellow sculptor of the person who did it was not so polite about it and called it rather ordinary, but I think it's wonderful. And you can almost feel those sort of brightly colored shirts that Nelson Mandela wore. What an incredible man he was, to have campaigned against the unfairness of the apartheid system. He never rejected the use of violence. And actually, all three of these people are campaigners and had different views on this. But Mandela spent 27 years in jail, largely in Robben Island, but other places as well, before being released, with de Klerk coming up with the first free elections in the Republic of South Africa and becoming its first Black president in 1994. So a very, very fitting person to have his place in Parliament Square, I think. And it was unveiled in 2007 by Gordon Brown, the then Prime Minister. Now, the two views of Mohandas, which was his name, Gandhi, who became known as Mahatma, the great soul, the man who liberated the entire subcontinent of India from British rule in 1948, surely also a very, very deserving figure in Parliament Square. But he didn't get here until March 2015. The Indian Finance Minister unveiled the statue, and it is quite significant because it's lower than all the other statues in the square. And this was a specific request from the Gandhi Statues Commission, so that he felt more with the people. And this was very much his trademark, his humbleness, his humility, the adoption of the dhoti, the traditional poor Indian man's clothing. So who was to know that a young South African, British trained lawyer who'd studied in the Inner Temple in London in the 1880s was going to go on to lead this gigantic continent to freedom from British rule, wearing a loincloth and round glasses. I think just an incredible thing. And by the way, it was 100 years of the anniversary of him leaving South Africa and going back to India, was 2015. And lastly, the first woman to make it into Trafalgar Square, and who could be more deserving than Millicent Fawcett. And she was one of the very first women to support votes for women, a suffragist, and she became president of the National Union of Women's Suffrage Societies, and was a towering figure in that movement. Her statue was created by Gillian Waring, a female sculptor, and it has this wonderful plinth with photographs of 55 women involved in the movement round the bottom, which aren't in this picture. And she's holding a banner containing words that she wrote about a fellow suffragette called Emily Davidson, who was the woman who tragically threw herself or fell in front of the King's horse at the Epsom Derby and lost her life. Millicent didn't espouse the violent tactics of some of her fellow campaigners. And Gandhi, of course, you will remember, was in favour of peaceful protest. So a different approach from some of the other suffragettes like Emmeline Pankhurst, who favoured a more direct action. And Emily Davison herself actually had put bombs in post offices. She'd broken windows and thrown stones, and so she was a direct activist too. So very fitting that we have this towering figure in that movement in her working clothes, holding up her banner in Parliament Square today. So thank you for that. And I'm just going to pass on to Tim, who's going to tell us about the last of our statues.
Thanks, Emma. Fantastic as ever. I'm going to talk about George Canning. Now, I've got a bit of a penchant for lost causes. And if there ever was a lost cause, it was our Prime Minister, George Canning. He holds the record for being the shortest, not shortest in stature, but shortest the reign of a Prime Minister, 119 days. That's all he had. Also, he was one of the very, very last people to challenge a fellow parliamentarian to a duel up on Putney Heath. Now, the problem was the chap he challenged was Lord Castlereagh, who was a renowned crack shot. And George Canning had never handled a gun in his life. So the duel happened. George Canning was injured in the leg. He did survive, but he carried on and then became our shortest reigning Prime Minister. But I'm going to leave you with this thought. The question which I always ask myself when I see George Canning, why is he dressed as a Roman? Is he off to a toga party? Will we ever know? Back to you, Don.
Great. Well, that's it from us this evening in terms of our sort of talks and presentations. So if you've got questions, there's one or two, so we'll pick those up in a second, but if you've got questions, put them into the chat. I'll just do the sort of commercial break now, which is we've got various talks coming up. This week, Leo's going to talk about archaeology in the City of London on Wednesday. I'm doing the Winston Churchill, as mentioned, on Thursday. Rachel's doing Southwark and the South Bank next Sunday. And Emma's doing the Cotswolds on Wednesday week. So those are all coming up soon. Tim has got his History of the Theatre at the end of the month. So that's a brand new one. Emma's doing History of the River Thames, or a walk along a section of the River Thames towards the end of the month as well. That's a brand new one. Next Monday, we've got another one of our charity talks, and that's done by a friend of ours, called Laura Adams, called Brave and Brilliant Bloomsbury. And she's done that once already, but it was really popular, and she's doing it this time as one of our charity talks. It's about famous women associated with Bloomsbury, and as we've established this evening, you are all huge fans of Bloomsbury. That's why 49% of you voted for Russell Square and not for some of the better squares that were.
You're never gonna live this down.
So she's going to talk about the women associated with Bloomsbury, and there are two. It's pay what you like. So go on to uktoursonline.com, make your way to forthcoming tours, click on the button, and you can pay what you like, whether that's £1, whether that's £100, to come along and listen to Laura talk about that. And all of the money, all of the ticket money goes to a couple of charities, one to do with violence against women, the other the East London Women's Museum. So do consider going along to that. Right, any questions? Given his short tenure, why was Canning honoured with a statue? Timothy.
I was trying to write it down, but I failed. It was basically, I mean, I'm being flippant about it. He had a very, very long and illustrious political career before he became Prime Minister. So he was actually a very successful politician. It's just, unfortunately, 119 days, and then he died from flu. There you go.
I had got one thing, I missed out one killer thing that might have put St James's Square at the top.
Let it go, Emma, let it go.
Not that I am bitter about this, don't worry, I will get over it. But that house that I showed you, that I went through so quickly at the end, Norfolk House, was actually General Eisenhower's headquarters during World War II. And it's where Operation Overlord was actually planned from. So, final fact.
Let it go.
A little plaque on the wall, and I think there's lots of scaffolding, like most of London. There's lots of scaffolding in the square at the moment. I think they're doing
that building that the plaque was on is actually being demolished at the moment, and I don't know whether the plaque will go back, because there is actually there's a rule that says you can't put the plaques on unless it was the correct building, that they enforce more rigidly now than they used to. So it will be very interesting to see what happens.
Oh, right. And a question about Westminster Hall, which I don't know the answer to, but Rachel's kicked it to me, and I'm probably going to kick it to Emma, because when did the courts finish there? And did they move to the present Royal Courts of Justice? I've
got an answer to that. Thank you for that question. So when the Royal Courts of Justice opened in 1882, they were opened by Queen Victoria. So very good question. Until then, the Court of King's Bench, as it was called, sat, and now we call it Queen's Bench because we have a Queen on the throne, and it sat in Westminster Hall until then. Yeah, so good question.
Great. And did they really use London squares to bury plague victims in? I think the answer to that is that they built squares over plague pits in certain parts, because Charterhouse Square, for example, over in near Smithfield, when they've done work there, they have certainly found a large plague pit from the original Black Death 1300s plague over there. And there is also one a little bit further on near Spitalfield Square as well. So
my Crossrail tour, Don.
Right.
All about it on my Crossrail archaeology tour. But yes,
so, on Leo's second of her archaeology tours, she mentions all these discoveries of plague pits across London as they've dug tunnels through the city. They have unearthed quite a lot of these.
Yeah, but most of the squares, as Don said, most of the squares come later. So the layout of our kind of open spaces, that doesn't really start, as we said, until the middle of the 1600s. And so most of our last big outbreak of plague was the Great Plague of 1665. So anything after that, they are putting, built on top of, as opposed to using existing in the 16th, 17th century and earlier, they would have just been open spaces.
And it just sort of goes to show again how what a premium there is on sort of land values, that a plague pit, people did not find it unusual to then sort of develop the space above it. London is built up on these layers and layers and layers of history. So dig a hole in London and you descend through the centuries as you go.
But for example, somewhere like St James's Square was actually built on fields. There wasn't anything to knock down and build, because London hadn't arrived at that place yet. So it began the whole West End development.
That's right. It's sort of Henry VIII taking over the St James's Hospital or monastery, the leper hospital, gave another sort of centre to the development of London. So it'd been growing in the city, it grew in Westminster. Wherever the king goes, the hangers-on want to hang on, and therefore the areas get developed around it.
It is said, isn't it, Don, that the bones of the lepers in the hospital that was taken over by Henry VIII, where he then built a palace for his wife, Anne Boleyn, were thrown into the hunting park of Green Park. and that therefore is one of the reasons why flowers do not grow in green.
Yes, I think it should work the other way around, because I once heard a story about the British Embassy in Paris, that you can grow anything there because it's built on the graveyard of a leper hospital, and therefore the ground is wonderfully well fertilized. Any more questions? Anyone got anything else they want to ask of us this evening? Karzing usually attends summer classes at Oxford, which have been cancelled, as everything has, but things are getting back, and enjoys Radcliffe Square. So we are hoping that when in the UK lockdown ends, which we're given a date where things will get back to normal towards late June, that as well as doing some of the Zoom tours, the virtual tours, we will also go out and about into the city. So each of the 5 of us will be going out and pointing at things. So as things develop, and as we know what the situation is, so obviously it has to be completely safe for everybody, but if we do get back to that sort of normality, we will start organizing some of our virtual tours as actual tours for those of you who can reach London, or those of you who come to visit London. So we shall give you more notice on that as the situation develops, but certainly at least 2 of us have had our jab now, and I think we're the others are, yes, the 2 oldest have had their jab. The other 3 are all just far too young and probably won't be jabbed until.
I'm just going to get a look in until about December, I think.
Yeah, that's right. Leah's only 12.
I must say, my friends, it's a bit of a badge of honor. I keep saying, no, I'm not till July. Haven't you had it yet?
Yeah, well, the more decrepit amongst us have had our jabs now, and we will be shortly going out and hugging people in the street, whether they want us to hug them or not. So there is a normality, at least on the horizon. If we might not be able to set a perfect date for it yet, but there is the sun was shining in London today. The blossoms are out on the trees. The flowers are appearing. The vaccinations are spreading. So let us hope there is both an actual and a metaphorical spring arriving. So no more questions. That's your lot, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you very much for joining us. Do go to the website and see what else we've got coming up. Lovely to see you all again, and hope to see you all again soon. So thank you all very much, and good night. Jazz hands.
Thank you, everybody.
Bye-bye.
Thanks, guys.
Thank you.